August 9, 1974. A man sits alone in the Oval Office, staring at a piece of paper he never thought he would write. Just 2 years earlier, he had won one of the biggest landslides in American history. 60 million people voted for him. Now his own party wants him gone. Behind him, locked away in a secure vault, sit hundreds of hours of secret tape recordings. Recordings he ordered himself. Recordings he believed would protect him. He was wrong. In a few hours, he will walk out to a helicopter on the White House lawn, turn back one last time, and become the only president in American history to resign. His name is Richard Nixon, and to understand how he ended up here, you have to go back to a small farming town, a family with almost nothing, and a boy who was told from the very beginning that he would have to fight for everything he ever got. Richard Nixon was born in 1913, in a small house his father built with his own hands in Yorba, California. There was no money in that house. His father ran a lemon farm that failed, then a small grocery store that barely survived. 2 of Richard's brothers died young, one from tuberculosis, one from a brain tumor, and Richard watched his mother grieve both of them, while still finding the strength to hold the family together. He grew up believing that nothing would ever be handed to him. If he wanted something, he had to outwork everyone around him for it. He was smart, sharp enough to get into Harvard, but there was no money for the train ticket, let alone the tuition. So he stayed close to home, went to a small college instead, and studied like his life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. He graduated near the top of his class, made it into Duke University's law school on a scholarship, and even there, his classmates gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Gloomy Gus. He didn't smile easily. He didn't make friends easily, but he never stopped working. After law school, Nixon came home to California, married a school teacher named Pat, and served in the Navy during World War II. When he came back, he did something almost nobody expected. He ran for Congress against a well-known, well-funded Democrat, and he won, using an aggressive, relentless campaigning style that would become his signature for the next 3 decades. He didn't just want to beat his opponents, he wanted to bury them. In just 6 years, he went from a small-town lawyer to a United States senator, and by 1952, at only 39 years old, he was chosen to run for vice president alongside a war hero named Dwight Eisenhower. It should have been the highlight of his life. Instead, it almost ended his career before it began. Just weeks into the campaign, newspapers exposed a secret fund that wealthy supporters had set up to pay Nixon's expenses. The press called it a slush fund. Reporters demanded he be dropped from the ticket. Nixon's entire future came down to a single television broadcast, watched by 60 million Americans, where he had to defend himself live, with no script, no safety net. He talked about his modest finances, his wife's plain cloth coat, and one gift he refused to give back: a small black and white dog his daughters had named Checkers. It worked. The public flooded the network with support. Eisenhower kept him on the ticket, and Nixon learned the most important lesson of his political life that night. When his back was against the wall, he could talk his way out of anything, in front of any camera, no matter how bad the truth actually was. For 8 years, Nixon served as vice president, learning the machinery of power from the inside. But in 1960, he ran for president himself against a young senator named John F. Kennedy, and he lost by less than 1% of the national vote. It was close enough to haunt him. Many of his supporters believed the election had been stolen through fraud in certain states, but Nixon refused to challenge the results, choosing not to drag the country through a bitter recount. 2 years later, he ran for governor of California, and lost that too. Standing in front of reporters after that defeat, exhausted and bitter, he told them they wouldn't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore, because this, he said, was his last press conference. Nearly every political expert in the country believed him. His career looked finished. But Nixon did not quit. He spent the next 6 years rebuilding himself piece by piece, campaigning for other Republicans, making connections, studying the mistakes that had cost him before. And in 1968, in the middle of a country torn apart by the Vietnam War, race riots, and 2 devastating assassinations, Richard Nixon ran for president again. And this time, he won. The comeback was almost unheard of in American politics. A man written off as finished had clawed his way back to the very top of the country he had once been told he could never truly belong to. As president, Nixon proved he was capable of enormous, historic achievement. In 1972, he did something almost no one believed possible. He flew to Communist China, a country the United States had refused to even acknowledge for over 20 years, and he sat down face to face with Chairman Mao Zedong, opening a relationship between the two nations that reshaped the entire balance of global power. That same year, he negotiated a landmark arms control agreement with the Soviet Union, easing decades of nuclear tension during the height of the Cold War. At home, he created the Environmental Protection Agency, ended the military draft, and worked to bring American troops home from Vietnam after years of brutal, costly war. By the time he ran for re-election in 1972, the American people rewarded him with one of the largest landslide victories in the country's history, winning 49 of 50 states. Richard Nixon stood at the absolute peak of American power, and almost nobody knew that the seeds of his own destruction had already been planted months earlier in a quiet office building in Washington, D.C. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. They weren't there to steal money. They were there to plant listening devices and photograph documents, part of a wider pattern of surveillance and sabotage tied to Nixon's re-election campaign. A security guard noticed tape covering a door latch that shouldn't have been there, called the police, and 5 men in suits were arrested in the middle of the night. At first, it seemed like nothing. The White House press secretary called it a third-rate burglary and moved on. Nixon himself denied any involvement and went on to win re-election in a landslide just months later. But 2 young reporters at the Washington Post refused to let the story die, and slowly, painfully, piece by piece, they began pulling a thread that would eventually unravel the entire presidency. What investigators discovered was not just a single break-in, but a pattern of abuse of power that reached the highest levels of the government. There were secret slush funds used to pay for political sabotage. There were enemies lists, targeting journalists, politicians, and activists for harassment through the IRS and other federal agencies. And there was something Nixon himself had ordered installed in the Oval Office years earlier, believing it would protect his legacy: a voice-activated taping system that recorded nearly every conversation that took place in that room. When investigators learned the tapes existed, they demanded access to them, certain the recordings would reveal the truth about what the president knew and when he knew it. Nixon fought for over a year to keep them hidden, invoking executive privilege, taking the fight all the way to the Supreme Court. In July of 1974, the court ruled against him, 8-0. He had no choice left. He had to release the tapes. What the tapes revealed destroyed him. Nixon could be heard directing efforts to obstruct the FBI's investigation just days after the break-in, using the CIA to interfere with a domestic criminal case for purely political reasons. It was undeniable proof of a cover-up, coming directly from the president's own voice, in his own words, recorded by a system he had installed himself, believing it would one day vindicate him. Even members of his own party, men who had defended him for 2 years, told him privately that his support in the Senate had collapsed completely. There was no path forward. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation on live television and announced he would resign the presidency, effective the following day. The next morning, he gathered his staff for one final, emotional goodbye in the East Room, walked out onto the White House lawn, climbed the steps of a helicopter, turned back one last time, and raised both arms in his signature victory sign, even as he was leaving the highest office in the country in complete disgrace. For the rest of his life, Richard Nixon tried to rebuild what the scandal had taken from him. His successor, Gerald Ford, granted him a full pardon just 1 month later, meaning Nixon would never face criminal trial for what happened during Watergate. But the pardon could not undo the damage to his name. He spent his final 2 decades writing books, traveling the world, and quietly advising later presidents on foreign policy, slowly working to reshape how history would remember him. Some of it worked. Historians still credit him for opening relations with China and for real achievements in foreign policy that reshaped the modern world. But none of it could fully erase what came out of those tapes, or the image of a president lying to the American people on national television while insisting, again and again, that he was not a crook. Richard Nixon died in 1994, mourned by world leaders as a brilliant strategist, and remembered by millions of ordinary Americans as the man who proved that even the most powerful person in the world is not above the truth eventually catching up with him. What makes Nixon's story so unsettling, even 50 years later, is that the same instincts that built him also destroyed him. The same relentless drive that carried a poor boy from a failing lemon farm all the way to the presidency also convinced him he could control and hide anything that threatened him. He wasn't brought down by one single mistake. He was brought down by the belief that the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to him, and by his own voice, recorded in his own words, kept as insurance, and used instead as the very evidence that ended him. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments which moment hit you the hardest, and subscribe to Graphy for more true stories of the people who shaped history, for better or for worse.